This is Life Worlds, the place where we explore life through other eyes and minds. Let's flip the script and discover how to orient your world around nature. I'm Alexa Firminish. Come join me as we get down and forage for fungi, stalk coyotes, draft laws for rivers, hum with beehives, sing bird language, and help beavers to dam again. Let these stories spark your reconnection to nature's multiverse. Learn how to bring ecosystems back to life, become an agent for other intelligences, and begin to see how you too are the sum of all life worlds. Hello, my friends. Welcome back to Life Worlds. Today we'll be speaking about holistic landscape restoration. First, I want to paint a little scene for us. And it's a scene that some of us may unfortunately know all too well. Imagine a landscape. The earth below is gaping for water through its cracked lips. Above cling the parched trees, their desiccated leaves peeling off shoulder blades like forgotten garments. Rivers atrophied, foul-smelling, stilled and stagnant pools of matter that were never intended to stand still. Fish swim in dazed circles, finding no recourse upstream or down. Fires blaze at the merest hint of flame. The deafening silence left behind when species have extincted, abandoned, or migrated elsewhere to seek shelter. Human habitations, doorways swinging halfway open. Wind, the only living force still here, along with the occasional group of beard-chasing teenagers finding shelter for a night. It's been estimated that about 30 to 40% of the Earth's land area has been degraded, meaning that the natural cycles that regulate biodiversity, water, nutrients, and even social belonging have been incredibly disrupted. Many drylands are now hardening into deserts. And the area of degraded land is increasing by 12 million hectares each year. To kind of make that land, you can imagine it's about 32 soccer pitches per minute. I've probably been speaking for over a minute. So since we started this episode, 32 soccer pitches, football pitches. It's kind of even hard to imagine, isn't it? And this degradation of our landscapes, it lies at the root of multiple crises facing our world. These abandoned and damaged lands make communities vulnerable to risks like flooding, drought, fires, and landslides. Farmers lose production as the land dries up and the pollinators leave. Famines and food shortages ensue. Obviously, the social fabric frays, and many decide to leave, seeking their livelihood elsewhere. And if you think that in a world of tightening borders and a growing sense of scarcity, such displacement and mass migration of the millions will increasingly drive global instability and conflict. And so for this reason, or rather these reasons, landscape restoration at scale is an imperative. And it is also a healing approach because it combines so many solutions to the overlapping pain points I've just described. It's a profound regeneration of both the ecological and the social. Today, we are going to be speaking with Willem Ferwerda, a Dutch ecologist and entrepreneur, and the founder of Commonland, which is an organization based in the Netherlands that he founded in 2012. Before this, Willem spent over 17 years at the IUCN in the Netherlands, where he led the Rainforest Conservation Fund and later served as its executive director, supporting more than 1,500 conservation projects in 40 countries. Now, Commonland has been engaging in one of the most effective and brilliant holistic landscape restoration efforts at scale. They operate in 20 plus countries, and some of their significant projects include over 500,000 hectares in South Africa, 1 million hectares in Spain, in Andalusia, 300,000 plus in Australia's Western Wheat Belt, and the peat meadows in Netherlands as well. Their long-term ambition is nothing short of incredibly aspirational, and that is what we need today. It's to restore 100 million hectares globally by 2040. So that's just about 5% of the planet's degraded land. Now, part of Commonland's success can be attributed to an innovative and intuitive model that they've piloted called the 4 returns model. It's a scalable framework and it can be used in practically any context. In their own words, the 4 return framework enables anyone, no matter their background, to understand how to go about restoring their local ecosystem with other people. And so, what are the 4 returns? I think that they're helpful to understand when you look at their flip side or their opposite. So the 4 losses. And these 4 losses are brought about very much through our current economic model, which prioritizes very short-term return of investment per hectare. This leads to degradation of ecosystems, monocultures. We extract one thing from a landscape and kind of ignore the real complexity and polycultural necessity to have many more returns per landscape than just maybe one crop. And so these 4 losses are loss of community, loss of biodiversity, soil and water, loss of jobs and prosperity, and loss of purpose or hope, soul. So if you think about the 4 returns that come by with ecosystem restoration, you would get social returns to your community, natural returns to the ecosystems, financial returns through local businesses that thrive, and interestingly, a return of inspiration, which is defined as futures to believe in, and which is kind of, in fact, the return of spirituality and soul. And of course, these returns strengthen each other and lead to a sort of emergent co-creation in every landscape. These 4 returns, I like this kind of numerical matrix framework I'm about to lay out. So these 4 returns are put in place via a 5-step process, which they call the 5 elements. So the first one of this would be the establishment of a community landscape partnership with multiple stakeholders. So think you bring policymakers, farmers, education institutions, financiers all around the table. And all of these work on reaching a shared understanding and vision for their landscape. They actually use a process called Theory U from MIT's Presencing Institute. If you don't know it, I'll link it in the show notes. It's very interesting. It's a framework for profound systems change to guide individuals and groups through a process of sensing, presencing, and realizing an emergent future. I really actually have worked with it myself, and I think it's a great process. Then the second step of these 5 elements, they build a landscape plan with 3 different zones. So you have a sort of natural protected core zone, a combined zone where you can imagine bioeconomies and businesses of food, fiber, etc., region ag, agroforestry. And then an economic zone, which is obviously typically concentrated in an urban area, things like infrastructure and processing. The strategy is then implemented, number 4. And number 5, a monitoring and learning system is put in place over a 20-plus year time span. And now this piece is actually super important because 20-plus years are the kinds of timescales we need at minimum to think about when we work with complex ecological and social systems. And yet very much we hardly ever think in these timescales when we're looking at landscape restoration. You know, maybe people get 5-6 years for funding. And this process enables a variety of stakeholders to create a shared understanding of what they personally and collectively envision for their landscape and to share their dreams together of a holistic landscape restoration process. And as I've mentioned, this process has now been adopted across 20 plus countries by a very large growing movement of organizations. And Commonland has set up regional learning networks for many landscape restorationists to learn from each other and to share their experience. So far, I've given you a practical stance on all of this, which I personally think is more than enough to fill a whole episode, right? Because the effort of bringing communities together and developing landscape visions is an act of beauty in and of itself. But here's where it gets even more interesting. From the get-go, Willem has been just as focused on the inner dimension of restoration, the 4th return, the return of inspiration or soul. So that's to say that ecosystem restoration is not only what you see happening in the external work, it also helps to reconnect us with who we are. The healing of ecologically degraded landscapes is directly tied to the restoration of the human spirit and what I would call our souls. As Willem has said, Contact with life's diversity opens the door to healing within ourselves and with others. We aim to restore the functioning of the landscape, ecologically, socially, and economically, and most importantly, spiritually, so that it is resilient to future changes. And so today we'll center too on the kinds of social and human transformations that restoration engenders. You've heard this line of thinking before on the podcast. Yet, what I find fascinating and encouraging is its applicability to millions of acres of degraded lands where healing is needed the most for both human souls and natural systems. And Commonland, along with several other organizations globally, show that this has been proven out, it is possible, and it is happening as we speak. We'll also touch on how storytelling forms the basis of any transformational processes and different magic moments that arise in community discussions, as well as the potential for religion to act as a lever for change, and how all of this begins to bring about a newly embodied global landscape ethic. So that's it from me. Over to our conversation with Willem.
Willem, good morning. It's so wonderful to see you here. Thank you for being on Life Worlds.
Most welcome. Wonderful to speak to you today.
Yeah, before jumping in, I would be amiss not to share a little bit of the email correspondence that you sent me the last days. You have just returned from Albania, working with a group of different NGOs working on, I believe, 2 million hectares of restoration, and that's been a project for about 10 years. Before we launch into all the things, just how was that trip and what was the energy like? And yeah, if there's anything you want to mention about really just having been in the field with people doing amazing work, I would love to presence that.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, it was first time for me in Albania, and this group of NGOs supported by a fund now for more than 10 years is doing amazingly work. They really want to connect the natural areas and the protected areas with each other. It's a cross-border area, Albania, North Macedonia, and Greece. And so I met this director of this fund a few months ago, and she really wanted to. Yeah, she said you should come over with your colleagues just to share your thoughts on holistic landscape management and restoration, and how we can probably use that framework you worked on. So we shared that in 2 days with more than 25 people, leaders in the field in that area. People who are really, very much committed and are working in the field sometimes for more than 30 years. So they know very much well the challenges, the difficulties, and and this holistic way of thinking really opened up their eyes because they came very much from the conservation world.
Mm.
And we've learned a lot about the challenges, and we think we have agreed to continue working together, and we will guide and help them, and they will help us, of course, also by making this happen. And they have the beauty is they are backed by a long-term patient capital fund, more than 20 years. So that is critical in our work. If you have those actors that can support these processes.
100%.
So, yeah, it was amazing.
A little bit later, I'd love to get into some of the different cultural nuances that you might see in some of those projects. I mean, that part of the world is so foreign to me. Willem, I think what's so interesting and just like fascinating about you, and a reason why I've been so excited to get you on the show is, you and the organization, you've helped initiate massive landscape restoration projects, that span decades and thousands of hectares. It's very tangible and practical work, which I love. And, your CV speaks for itself. And yet so much about what you write and speak about. And I remember our first in-person conversation maybe 2-3 years ago was really around this. It's about spirituality and about how the landscape restoration industry needs to restore even our souls, right? And that meaningful restoration starts from within. So I want to start there because I think this is quite radical coming from a scientist and from a practitioner. And so I want to ask you, has it been difficult to hold that perspective and speak from that perspective? Like, have you ever been worried that people would discredit you or sort of make fun of you for using that kind of language?
Yeah. Yes, it definitely has been difficult. but it was, in my being from the beginning. So I could not, it has always had been part of my life, and then gradually you learn how to use the right language for the right target groups. So I'm a very much aware of how far you can go in conversations, and I use different words, and I use also different literature and different backgrounds and cultures, because in some cultures this is very normal, and in other cultures we tend to forget where we come from and how this is, yeah. Sometimes we have replaced it with other values, quite often very values that are very much associated to materialism, money, and so on. So I'm trying to move around with the narrative, and using the knowledge of the different cultures and scientific backing, because sometimes it is scientifically backed. But it's definitely part of it. And at a certain moment, when I founded Commonland, or when I left my former work at IUCN, I realized, it's time to bring this all together in a narrative and in an approach that help a lot of actors to basically restore the ecological principles in landscapes, and make sure that this is part of your internal process. You can't make a distinguish. So you basically heal the outside world. No, no, you heal the inside world by healing the outside world, and vice versa. Now I can share with you that in a very open way, but if I go to and do those workshops, or give presentations, or go to the field with farmers, or with indigenous people, or with very great conservationists who have been working in the field for 30, 40 years, and so on, yeah, I need to find that entry point. And when I started Commonland, I remember that I had several discussions with my former friends, and still my friends, within the conservation world, within the big NGOs, WWF, IUCN, the Nature Conservancy, and so on. And they quite often said, but what is this strange thing that you now named the return of inspiration? And but I have had good discussion with them. At a certain moment, they said, listen, if you are appassionado, I mean, that's why you do this work. So I'm approaching you as a person who's very much committed, and sometimes for decades doing this work, despite of all the challenges and the difficulties. You have been continuing doing this work. Why are you doing this? Is this because of science, or is this something else? And of course, the answer was, no, this is something else. This is because I need to do this. So if you then do a deep dive in those conversations, and quite often you end up with a moment in time that person had, that changed his or her life. And quite often these moments were mostly associated with nature, and I call it a magic moment, sometimes with art, and sometimes with the interaction with someone else, someone who inspired, who was very inspirational, and changed the mindset, or the heart set, you could say, or opened up the heart. And when you give space and have the time for those, or open up the space for those conversations, then it resonates, and you can go further. And yeah, so basically what I did is just I put it in a framework, so that this let's say the link between the inside and the outside world could not be ignored.
I really respect that dancing around language. And I guess now, after all of these years, right, Commonland was started in 2012, so we're over a decade in.
No, yes, that's correct. Let's say I framed the framework in 2012, and founded Commonland to make it happen, to do it basically in 2013. Yeah.
And what have you found that inspirational or spiritual dimension contributes and adds to the technical solutions, like rewilding, ecological corridors, regenerative ag, rotational grazing, these very technical things? What
Yeah.
have you seen now after all of these decades? Like, how does it manifest? How does it show? I would love, even like, if you have like examples from the field, that would be very cool to hear.
Yeah. So we started in 5 large landscapes in India, Australia, South Africa, the Netherlands, and Spain. And what we've seen is that the narrative resonates, so that it helps people to understand. Let's say, first of all, it helps them to connect their inner world, their purpose, their inner purpose, with the outside world. So that is the basis of transformation from a, let's say, a conventional farmer to a region ag farmer, and to overcome all those problems that you will face if you do this transformation. The second thing, it helped them to understand the holistic point of view of that landscape. Said things are connected. The watershed is connected to agriculture. Agriculture is connected to social and social cohesion and so on, and to healthy foods. All these things where it helped them to understand the real connection of those things that might sound very logical, but for most people it isn't logical, and they have lost those connections. But I think the most important connection is that it led to a process of inner inner understanding. Maybe that is the best way of mentioning it. And I remind, I always like that quote of an important Australian farmer who said, many regenerative farmers underwent personal transformations before they could successfully restore their land. And this change is not just technical, but deeply psychological and even spiritual. That is Charles Massey, who wrote a beautiful book called The Call of the Reed Warble.
I love that book. So I guess maybe you could paint 2 hypotheticals. Let's say there's one landscape where that inspirational element isn't being brought forth. And I would love for you to speak about practically how you do it. I'm sure it's in the workshops and the frameworks and the theory you work, but maybe you could elaborate a bit on that. So let's say there's a landscape where people are doing restoration and they don't have that. And then there's one where they are doing these more inspirational, targeted activities. How would it, from the outside, how would it look different? And how might, where might one end up versus the other? Because I think also some of our listeners have never worked in landscape restoration and they don't even know what that means. And so I'd be curious, tangibly, maybe you've seen projects that you've worked in that don't have that, and you're this is how they look and feel versus ones that do. I would love if you could make that come alive.
Yeah. Now, so if you take the case of Spain, where we started to work in 2013-14, it's a huge area between Murcia and Granada. It's 1 million hectares, which is probably something like 3 times the size of Luxembourg, and it's really big. And when we came there were already a group of farmers and protected area managers and some entrepreneurs that were talking to each other because they knew that because of climate change, degradation, biodiversity loss, and water, especially the water issue, things were going down, and even more important, the social cohesion fall apart. So people, youngsters, left the area, went to cities, and did not come back. And when we came there, we had some profound conversations, but we started to ask them, what are your frustrations and what are your losses? What have you lost over the last decades or even longer? So the trauma of the region, we helped them to formulate their own trauma, personal trauma, but also, landscape trauma, or whatever you call it, so economic traumas. And one of the most important things that came out is that out of those conversations, that they lost the social cohesion and the communities. The villages were going down. You had a lot of ruins and abandoned houses and so on. The water table was going down. So all these things are. So, and then we opened up, let's say, the conversation and the space, and it took a while. I mean, you need to do it and repeat it again and again with other actors in those areas to have those conversations first. Then we moved into the topic of, if what would be your dream if you would not have any barriers, just open up your creativity and your heart, and what would be your dream for yourself, for your community, and for this area. So we made that connection. And of course, then you run into that was beautiful, that session, because then and then we said, oh, in 20 or 30 years, we know this is tough. The growth season is very short, so it doesn't go very fast. So, and of course, then the first answer there was, we want that people come back. We want to have the library, the public services, the hospital open again. We want to have the swimming pool open again. Actually, we want to have kids in the street again, young kids playing around. And that was the dream. And then you move further. Okay, if you want to make that dream possible, what would be the next chapter? Yes, then you need to have different forms of life, income and local economy stuff, and that is associated to different forms of agriculture, and that is associated to water, and that is associated to nature. So at the end, you end up in the you need to return what we call the biodiversity of those regions, healthy topsoils and so on, less erosion, fight climate change, or in our narrative we call it climate adaptation, in technical words, and to connect those technical solutions in the future with the more deeper purpose solutions and answers, their dreams, their passion, their pain, is actually what we do in those workshops. And we have a very structured approach, and we call that, of course, as maybe you've heard about it, we call it the 4 losses and the 4 returns. So we really made it in a way simple, because it's very complex. And if people in normally stakeholders deter the complexity. They don't like that. They don't know how to deal with that. But we peel it off like an onion to make sure that the complexity is easy to understand, and that you can deal with it, and that you can work on solutions with it. But you need to have some conditions. You need to be patient. The natural environment takes time to restore it or to conserve it and so on. So you need to think in decades. You need to be very much grounded. So we need to work with maps on understand the landscape. And of course, the finance is an issue, because we are still in our global economic model is still about exploitation and destruction, ecological destruction and social destruction, of course. So we need to understand and peel that off, and then move towards what are the bottom-up solutions, and how do they resonate with your soul quest, in fact, and that is something that people really understand, and they feel it, and that's where you open up their passion and drive. And sometimes that is difficult, because the pain and the trauma is hard to sometimes people don't want to talk about it, because the pain is so tough. But if you create that conditions together, and we use an approach called Theory U to make that happen, you create the conditions and the space and the time to open up those conversations.
I would imagine also that you get many different type of stakeholders in a room, and maybe these are people who don't usually interact, and so there's such beauty in hearing the story of someone else and seeing the similarities often with your own story, even if you're entirely quote unquote different people, and the farmer and the banker, but they're all in the landscape. And then it is like group therapy, right, in a way. And I, this landscape grief or trauma that you speak of, like, it's so real and will only increase, sadly, I think, just as, the future of desertification and other factors will grow. So what I'm hearing you say is you're sort of, you address the loss and you address some of the pain. And that's really important, because if people don't move through that, they're bottling things up. And then you also move into some of the dreams and passion. And that's sort of how this inspirational spiritual return gets activated. And then I'm curious, do you have processes for maintaining that throughout the projects? I mean, what is the role of maybe like ceremony or storytelling that in the landscape restoration work? Like, how does it continue to weave through alongside, as you mentioned, the very practical, maybe financial, economic, biological activities?
Yeah. No, the storytelling and the we call it festivities or whatever, is celebrations. It is super important. So we when I started Commonland, we started to work in the field, and we realized that storytelling was the way forward. And because then you make it practical, and people buy into it and understand it.
And what do you mean by storytelling, by the way? Because I think it can be quite abstract for all of us.
Yeah, okay. That is that you come up with examples from your own personal life, uh, that that deeply resonates. So I can, for instance, if you sit in a circle, let's say with farmers, conservation actors, entrepreneurs, bankers, as you mentioned, or a mayor, and then someone needs to start and open up, and you often do that by saying, hey, listen, when if we talk about this area, what was the most impressive experience that you might have had when you were a kid? And then you can start with yourself. I can share, or someone else, and that opens up the space. And then, so those stories are much more powerful than when you put on a flip chart with a graph, and that is going back. The biodiversity is going down, water is going down, etc. That will come later. But those stories, everyone has such a story, and whether such a story is inspirational or transformational, or a story about what happened to a person that was also transformational in a negative sense, could also be a story, a pain, or whatever, or violence or something. Those stories are the basis of the conversation first, and also of the transformation process as well. And then you can in a later stage, you can draw parallels with other stories from other regions, and you see that there are similar stories and similar sharings there. But I think the and that's why I called it magic moments, sharing of magic moments of people, of their magic moments. What changed their life? What was that important? It could be a loss as well as a beautiful thing, but that creates bonding, and from that bonding you continue. And of course you can, if we talk about storytelling within the context of Commonland, we increasingly, with our communication team, we share those stories through video and Insta, whatever. But that's the next chapter that will come later.
And the part on festivities and ceremonies and sort of ongoing,
Yes.
quote unquote, rituals that might not use that language, but
Yeah, no. So there are always rituals in those landscapes with people, and sometimes those rituals have been forgotten. Sometimes they come up. Like, I give you the example of the Aboriginal people in Australia. I mean, we started working in WA, in West Australia, which is a very degraded area, deforested by the British already, in the beginning of the last century, heavily infected by chemical monoculture, agriculture, and mining. And of course, you have Aboriginal community there that had been through a very painful process, and even genocide, during the last 200 or more years. So at a certain moment, they knocked on our door of the local team that we were supporting, that they wanted to participate. I think it was in 2018 during a large conference. And they asked, and so we said, how do you want to participate? And they said, we want to be in the lead of this huge conference. So we want to be that our agenda will be the agenda of the entire conference. And we agreed, and that happened. And that changed entirely that conference. Suddenly, they were in the lead, and they were able to speak from the heart, with their pain as well, and let's say bring all those actors together around a deeper, holistic, shared understanding of that landscape, and the pain of that landscape, and the pain of them as well. Because white people or Aboriginal people, they all had their own pain and trauma processes. And that was beautiful, and that entire process was built along stories from different people. So they opened up in that conference the different stories of that landscape, and the people who have been there sometimes for millennia and sometimes for only a few generations. And that bonding now in that landscape is that has increased the bonding in that landscape to be able to help actors like farmers becoming more regen egg farmers. The Noongar group, Aboriginal group that is living there, we were able to support their enterprise on restoration, planting trees, native trees, and so on.
I think there's a distinction in my understanding between the stories and the rituals and ceremonies part. And so what I'm wondering is, you said something about festivities. I imagined like a harvest festival. Is that way off the mark? When you said festivities, I had this image of like, okay, we're 5 years in, it's been tough, but let's like stop and celebrate. And I don't know how often that
Yeah.
happens in the
No,
field.
that happens very often. That happens very often. But also sometimes something new pops up, like in Spain. In Spain, a few years ago, there was a group of the local group there, Alvalol, realized that they have caves there and cave drawings, so ancient cave drawings. In one of those caves, there is a shaman drawn into it, and they're very proud because they see that as their ancestors. And at a certain moment, they said, "We want to celebrate. We want to come together and plant trees and aromatic plants in the shape of that shaman on 16 hectares near the highway." And that's what they did. And that just popped up. And why was that? Because of this return of inspiration. They said, we feel so much inspired by those cave paintings, but we never show that. So we want to make sure that this shaman, who once were probably sitting in that cave and saw the landscape that at that time probably was very green with a lot of trees and so on and waterways. We want to honor that shaman with this large activity. So different NGOs and even the city council came together, and the city said, okay, we give you 16 hectares, and then the other one said, I will give you the lavender and the rosemary to plant in that form, and that's what I did. And now we have those beautiful, planted shaman in as a kind of artwork, local artwork there in the landscape.
That's super cool, and you couldn't have planned that. I'm super curious. Do you find you've worked across many organizations as well, and do you find that many global restoration projects, like this kind of creativity and art and regeneration, happens anyway, or do you find that many projects don't have that, and do they feel quite different? Like, have you come across many just instrumental, we're just planting the trees and we go, or does this make its way in anyway?
I think it happens anyway in one way or another, but I think it has not been. I don't think it has not been very made specific within, let's say, the soul and spiritual context, because people are afraid for using those words. They know something is there. They quite often, and especially the elder ones and the people who are very close to landscapes, farmers, but also especially indigenous people. But I think it should be, it can we should give that more openness and help to blossom more.
Mm.
The let's say these deeper spiritual context of what I call restoration or landscape management or integrated landscape management, holistic landscape management should be much more should be much more used in this way. It has been ignored. We think it's a technical exercise, but of course technicalities are super important and science. But what we need to make sure this is all about people. Restoration and the regenerative world is about people, and about how we are part of nature. We are part of nature. That means we need to recognize that again.
It reminds me of that wonderful quote by that Australian man, I forget his name, I am not protecting the rainforest, I am the rainforest protecting itself. And I love that flip, which is really ontologically important, which is I'm a piece of this protecting itself. I'm not an actor imposing. And I hear you. I think being explicit about that inner dimension gives people permission to show up as like a full human. And in many ways, I think also, you being very, how will I say, brave and just using that language explicitly as well, especially in a European context, and you're a man. I mean, it's interesting. And I think giving permission is so key. And so I hear you saying that. And maybe taking it one step further, we'll speak about landscape ethics in a second, but Aldo Leopold has this great quote and he says, and I think you sent it to me in one of the things possibly, or I pulled it up from somewhere, but the land is not merely soil. It is a fountain of energy flowing through a circuit of soils, plants, and animals. So maybe going a level deeper, and again, because of the name Life World, it's how we come to see the world through the perspectives of nature and inhabit that different body, if you will. Have you seen that the restoration work that you've done, and maybe examples come to mind, have you seen it sort of help stakeholders who have maybe been more distanced? And from that way of thinking, have you seen them begin to feel the landscapes as alive, as sentient, that there is not just these objects, right? But there is sort of like agency and aliveness and animacy there. Have you seen that happen?
Yeah, I've seen that happen, and I see it everywhere popping up. But people quite often did not have the language for it, because they have forgotten about it. So especially in our Western culture, they have forgotten about it. And with Western, I mean our more capitalistic society, because you have it everywhere, not only the Western world. But so what happens if you opens up this conversation, and that's what we do with this 4 returns framework, because we start with ROI. We want to maximize ROI, return of inspiration. Well, I need to talk to people who say that they need to maximize ROI, return on investment. So that by using these words, you start to create a bridge, because we are not against maximizing return on investments, but we are against maximizing return on investment per hectare, because if you add those two words, you get degradation. And with playing around with those words, you can also say, if you maximize return on investment per hectare, and that creates degradation. It also creates degradation in your own purpose and in your own soul, in your own being. And by playing around with those words.
Why does it do that?
Yes, because if you have time for those conversations, because then you end up in the fact that as a human being, you are part of nature. And people, by using different words, you say, I would say nature is our life support system. Do you agree with that? Yes, I agree with that. Okay, what does it mean if you continue with maximizing return on investment in your company per hectare? That leads always to degradation, because you take stuff out and you don't give back. Or it's not only about ecological stuff, it's also about social, what people would say social capital. Okay, if you maximize return on investment per hectare, you also make use of a lot of social capital, people, and you degrade the social cohesion, the social system. If you quite often you end up in those conversations with people in the business community, and then you help them to understand so that the next question is, what can I do? What can we do then? Yeah, and then you gradually move in. First of all, you help them to understand how this ecological world is working, and how they can play their role in it. Sometimes with tiny parts, a little bit of investment, bit different way of changing their behavior, and so on, buying different products and so on. And at a certain moment, they will be able to feel here that something is healing in their body, in their system, and they come back, and not immediately, but they come back, and we start to have a conversation about the real essence of life. And I see that these things are happening more and more. I'm pretty optimistic about the let's say the movement of regenerative, the regeneration movement. And I also see that that this entry point of inspiration and purpose, there's so many purpose-seeking people around, that this is the entry point for the work we do.
What have you seen as being the hardest part of that shift for maybe people that are coming from more of a technocratic background and have been more alienated from this part of themselves? You could call it
Yeah.
an extractive mindset or a maximizing mindset. What do you think is the hardest part of that shift?
Yeah, it's a tough question. I've learned to say no to a lot of those people. I just say no. So a lot of those people who only think in tech solutions or in 10% in 5 years return on investment people, I just say no to them more and more. I'm very bold then, or blunt, or whatever you call it, and I say listen, you're not a realist. I can't talk to you anymore. It doesn't make sense what you say.
I think the caveat there is you're right in terms of a large landscape restoration project. It could make sense for like a software product or something, but land doesn't work that way. So it's the wrong mindset for the wrong application. I
Yeah,
agree.
of course. They come with siloed solutions,
Mhm.
and we need to have holistic solutions. So of course you
Totally.
can have one technical solution within a large landscape that can be very
Mhm.
helpful, and
Mhm.
that's great. Of course, we always continue talking to those people, but if they would come with these solutions for landscape
Mhm.
restoration, and it's about tech and about maximizing return on investments, forget about it. And those people, the only way how you can reach out to those people is saying no, because I know, and I've experienced it several times. If you say no, they come back and they say, "Why did you
It's
say no?"
playing hard to get.
And then you have a conversation, and
Yeah.
gradually you sink in. And if they don't come back, that's fine. But quite often they come back, and you start to have a conversation. And at the end, you have a conversation about the real essence of life, and about their purpose and their traumas. And I can share my traumas, and we can have a real conversation. And that is not always easy, because there are a lot of, let's say, old white men, mostly men, who are just their heart is so closed that you can't reach out to them. But there are exceptions, and and they're beautiful exceptions. And I think it's my task to have those conversations with those people, especially because I'm an old man as well, or not too old, but I'm older than you are, definitely. And I think what I've seen is that more and more, that helps. So I need to make use of being a white old man, to open up other white old men. Although many of those white old men, to be honest, I don't. Uh, I prefer to work with other people sometimes.
Yeah, I think having quote unquote elders who are embodying part of the change and are able to meet like like a certain physical cohort group is actually really important. And you could have a conversation that I could maybe not have with them. I'd be
Mhm.
curious what kind of, speaking of business, before we move on quickly, what maybe just do you have one or two examples of what kind of regenerative business models like do flourish in this restoration work and that tread the line between being practical and spiritual? Maybe if you just have one or two examples, because
Yeah.
as you say, people also need money in pocket in these landscapes, and we need to work within the confines of this version of capitalism, as flawed
Mhm.
as it may be in certain regards.
Yeah. Now you see three groups of businesses in general, three type of businesses that are very much interested in this theme. Agriculture businesses, I mean food producing companies, insurance companies, and beverage companies, water.
Hmm.
Why? Because they're all close to the field, to the land, you could say, and especially insurance companies are a new group, because of the climate risks and the climate disasters you see everywhere, especially in places where people have an insurance, like
Mhm.
the disaster in Valencia a few months ago.
Yeah.
So these things are popping up. If we look in our work field and you think about regenerative ag or products, we've set up several companies in Australia, and Spain, and South Africa and the Netherlands. And what we've seen there is that it takes some time to set up such a company. You need capital, you need money to help them go through the gap of where you can make profit. But if you are able to work that out well with the right investors and people behind it, at a certain moment, it will grow and the risk will go down because you use the right examples in the field and the right productivity. So, for an example, in Australia, we've set up a company called Dirty Clean Food in Australia, and that's a company that is producing regenerative products from farmers, from regenerative egg farmers, and bring them to consumers directly in the Perth area, but also in Australia as a whole, and they're now reaching out to China and so on. And we've seen there that we've learned many lessons there, but we've seen that now they're moving up finally after 6-7 years, because they have a network of farmers, they have a network of consumers, the products are relatively okay priced, and the more providers, the more farmers and consumers they're now reaching out, and the marketing and so on. People know that if they buy those products, they will restore their own area, and that is an extra incentive of consumers that you can't find easily in the supermarket.
Mm.
So it's just one example. We have other examples also on milk and meat and whatever, but this is I think one of the finest examples that we can show.
Before I move us on very quickly, what would be the best resource for people listening who live in landscapes and want to start some regenerative business that is aligned with their ecological hearts? Like, where should people go for ideas or inspiration? Like, do you have resources? I can put them in the show notes, but acknowledging that, I like to get practical, because if you can't apply the philosophy of the change of heart you have to like how you feed your family, then it can cause a lot of pain and dissonance.
Yeah, that's a difficult one because there's so many the loads of great examples. The difficulty is that some of these products are relatively still, expensive. So the closer you are to your own landscape, where you can where you can probably find platforms where they provide these services, the better it is. And so in the Netherlands, we have many of those platforms. Grutto.nl is one, but as I mentioned, in Australia, it's Dirty Clean Food. So it still is a challenge. And but if you Google on regenerative agriculture in your local situation, on the different or nature inclusive agriculture or local farmers platforms, then you are already close to what you can find. And yeah, we can add some in the podcast later.
Yeah, perfect. I'll add some stuff to the show notes, maybe via email. You can throw some ideas. And Willem, I'm super curious, what has being in such a long-term relationship with degraded land taught you? Like, and almost like if you could embody the voice of those landscapes, but both you personally, and then if you were to speak on behalf of them, what would want to be spoken?
Yeah, for me, this whole quest started when I was very young, and maybe I shared it with you. I was as a kid, I had a very strong encounter with a snake, and with a snake that was dying because people were killing it. And as a kid, I asked that snake that was almost dying a question. I asked the snake, "What are they doing to you?" And the snake answered, immediately to me. They said, "They're killing themselves." And that powerful answer really changed my belief system. That was basically it. At that time, I really felt everything is a whole. We are part of the whole. This is all. So it was a deep spiritual experience that never left me, that formed me as I'm now. And for me, a landscape or being outside is being inside. There's no distinction. So yes, it hurts me my inside if something in the outside is being broken, and it makes me happy. It heals me if I can do something about it, whether that is in my own garden by just making sure that there's more biodiversity, by changing, some stuff in the garden, or at large scale. So when I started studying biology and tropical ecology, and went to the tropics and learned a lot about indigenous people, work with them and bit farmers, this was always my mantra. Where can I heal myself and heal the landscape? In whether that is in a conversation with one farmer, or doing a keynote for, I don't know, 100 business people. That is my being. I cannot separate that. So the landscape is in me, and I'm the landscape, or the ecosystem. You can use, I can use every jargon I want
Yeah.
for every for different publics. Different, doesn't matter. But it is. I feel completely absorbed in nature, and yeah, I don't know how to explain it. My English is not good enough to explain it in this language.
Yeah, it might not be a language thing, huh? And do you feel, I mean, having worked across all these landscapes and we keep seeing the degradation, like how have you changed as a result of this work? Maybe even just
Mm,
something recently, like maybe the last few years, there's
yeah.
projects you were in or contexts that with the natural world that really shifted you.
I think I have changed over time, and I'm still an activist in a way, and want to change things, but I've also learned to be more patient. Definitely. I've learned that if you give people the right language and tools, and deep, especially if you give them the tools to help them to come closer to their own purpose, this will change. Um, I've also learned that I'm not afraid for anything. I'm not, and I've also learned that there's no such a thing like control. You can only be a guide or a mentor, or a little bit, but you can't control. You can't control people. You cannot control projects. Uh, you Life will go along. Nature will sometimes take a route that is unexpected, but people are even more difficult in a way, because they can take a path that is unexpected at all. Um, I've also learned that art and creativity is a powerful way of working and healing, if you combine it with the natural, the natural things that we've been discussing. Um, and I became more optimistic than I always was an optimist, a realist and optimist, and I'm even more optimistic and realistic than ever before, despite of climate change and so on, because nature is much more powerful than climate change and people. So just trust nature, trust yourself, build this trustful relationship with nature, and everything will be okay. It sounds maybe very naive, but it's not. It's based on a lot of years of experience. And yes, you will get into pain and traumas, but if you are able to face the trauma and the pain, and see the wounds that it has, that it has created in yourself as a kind of witness, then it makes you so much stronger, and also it makes you a more friendlier and nicer person than you were before. But so I think I'm more friendlier and nicer than I was when I was young.
I wish that you could be like by people's bedsides, like soothing us to sleep with everything you just said. But I really resonate and appreciate that wisdom you shared. You shared something interesting with me also before our conversation. You have a book coming out, and I've spoken about that in the introduction. But you've spoken about a landscape ethic, and some people will know Aldo Leopold's and County Almanac, where he speaks of a land ethic, and it comes up in other writers as well. And you also highlighted this piece on religion and the Pope and the Laudato Si, right? And you wrote in
Mhm.
that article that so let's quickly talk about religion in the time we have left. Nature is the source from which all major religions emerged: the sages, the transmission of sacred books, mysticism, and spirituality. And what's unique about the Laudato Si, which was from the previous pope, is that for the first time, from a faith-based perspective, biodiversity is placed on an equal footing with humanity. I remember when I first read the Laudato Si, I was stunned. Like, there's this line where he writes about the earth as being a sister with whom we share our life. And so, um, like, why are you looking at religion all of a sudden? And I know that you spoke about spirituality, and religion's a bit different. And so, how do you see the presence of religious context showing up in your work? Do you see it as different
Mhm.
from spirituality, or why are you going to extra efforts to actually highlight it?
Yeah, I think we can't ignore that there's a lot of that you have all those religions, and they're a powerful in a way, a powerful way of reaching out to people. They have a lot of influence, as we can see. So, but of course, religion is man-made. Spirituality is already there, was already there. So that's the big
Hmm,
difference.
I like that
So
distinction. Yeah.
if you have man-made religions, then you can also make religions a little bit more opener for our real quest, which is how to live in harmony with nature as being part of nature for the coming, you know, age centuries, and that is the only way forward. If we want to live well on this planet, the only way forward is how to come into harmony with nature and how to work
Hmm.
with nature in such a way that we both, nature and us, as we part of the same metal, that same coin, that we can live in a kind of balance. And that's why I'm interested in what the what the original religions said in the holy books and so on. And if you look at the framework that we have coined, for instance, the zoning, we use 3 zones to understand what a landscape is. That is not something new. That already came out of the Vedas in the Indian
Hmm.
context. You have the village, which is the economic zone. Then you have the garden, where people have the agriculture zone. We call it the combined zone. And then you have the forest, which is actually the place where you only go if you are in spiritual need. And that was how the 3 zones. So it's nothing new, but as a tool, it really helps. And so I'm very happy if someone from some religious leader, like in this case Pope Francis, came with this Laudato Si, and that he united other religions to come together to talk about it. And I hope that this new pope, or Islam leaders, or Hindu leaders, or Jewish leaders or Christian leaders will come up with similar processes, that they can be enabler of these things instead of working against it. So I see it as a powerful group, um, and it can, because there's so many people working in, let's say, mainstream economics that have a religious, or that are part of a religion group, that it can influence those people.
I agree entirely. A few years ago, I met an incredible man called Martin Palmer, and he ran. You probably have come across him. He ran, yeah, ARC, the Alliance for Religious Conservation with
Yeah,
WWF, which
yeah,
was always intended to sunset, but also had a 20-year horizon, I think. And
yeah.
they documented so many community religious kind of ecological projects around the world. Like, I remember the monks, I think it was in Cambodia, ordaining trees and sort of, like saying, hey, the tree, you're also a monk. And the largest community managed project, I believe, in Cambodia is managed by the monks, and things like this.
Mhm.
And he said also they're the fourth largest investment group in the world, and so also, where are they putting their money? And in many places, the faiths are stepping in when there's an absence of the state. And so, and at in the canons of a lot of the faiths, especially when you go back to the more mystical origins,
Mhm.
Kabbalah or whatever it may be, or Gnostic Christianity, or
Yeah.
you have that kind of ethic. So I'm with you. I think it's a really important acupuncture point. Sort of as a closing question, then, you've spoken about this concept of a landscape ethic, and that we need a new landscape ethic as a guiding principle. It's not just about techniques or tools, as we've discussed today. So just as a closing question, what do you mean by a landscape ethic? Like, has that existed before? What would it look like? Why do you use that language? Have we just literally talked about it for the last hour and so it's explicit? But I'm just curious about that choice of language and frame.
Yeah, no, I think it is. Yeah, I think lots of people have been talking about it before, like Doc and Chris Tompkins. But also, you mentioned Aldo Leopold. I always remember that sentence that he wrote in his book, A Sand County Almanac, about we abuse land because we see it as a commodity belonging to us. But when we see land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect. And I think that is about landscape ethic. That is about how we need to relate to land and to biodiversity as we are part of it. So a landscape ethic, if we could find policies that where these landscape ethics are, where we can build in these a landscape ethic, I think we will solve a few crises at once: the polarization crisis, the biodiversity crisis. We might help a little bit to work better with climate, and we will have healthier products for healthier lives. So it is very much intrinsically connected to everything that matters, that we now trying to get our head around. But maybe the most important one is it does not polarize a landscape ethic, because everyone wants to live and beautify its own place, whether you're right or left winged. So it is the way to come together again around land, around your own place. And you can argue about what is beautiful, because that's always a question. But if you talk about nature, then it brings people together. And that's what I've seen everywhere in the world, and I think that's also part of our work and the essence of our work. It does not bring only people together, but it brings hearts together, and that's I think the most important thing.
Yeah, from my understanding, an ethic is not something that you just write down and people ascribe to. Like, an ethic comes about organically through praxis and the kinds of activities, honestly, that Commonland is doing, and other restoration groups. I mean, as you said, you heal the land, you heal yourself, you're in collaboration with people you wouldn't otherwise be with. Like, would you say that the ethic of which you're describing, it's not like a document that's enshrined. It's something that comes into being through like physical activities and like real things in the world, and all of a sudden you're in the ethic.
Yeah. It is about the how do you say that? The intrinsic value of yourself. People feel that. If you start talking about stuff where you that you don't believe yourself, people feel that immediately. So it is really about the intrinsic attitude of yourself. And I agree with you. I think you can write books about landscape ethics, or with all kind of a list of principles that you need to adhere to. But and those books are there. I mean, you don't need to rewrite them. They're there. It's more about living it and doing it. And then you can look after it and say, okay, there's some principles, and did we adhere to it? Yeah, oh, that's nice. But it just, that's what we try to do with Commonland. Of course, we have a set of principles and indicators and metrics and so on. We all did that work, and it helps people. But the real order of things is not that you first start to use your brain and then doing it with your hands, and then afterwards say, hey, I forgot about my heart, but let's bring it in. No, you need to start with your heart first, then rationalize how to do it, and then do it with your hands. And that's the right order. And we have forgotten about it. In all our economic models, and whatever you do in business and industry, it's about brains first, hands second. Oh yeah, there's something like heart. We talk about heart first, brain second, and then doing it with your hands. And then of course you follow up and learn and adjust where needed.
That's a good order. Well, from my understanding, Commonland, there are certain landscapes that you're very actively working with. So people listening can go to the website and see if that's happening in their region. And if it's not, you've got open toolbooks, which are exceptional, and I'll link them in the show notes. And I understand you also work with hubs. So let's say someone's listened to this and they're inspired and they're like, I want to bring this to my landscape. What do I do? Like, how should people engage with the organization?
Yeah. So we have, over the last 11, 12 years, we've learned a lot in 5 key landscapes, very big areas, and we continue with them. But over the coming 10 years and later on, we are focusing more on learning and how to help others to make this happen. And we do that through hubs and landscape clusters in the regions where we work. Now in Spain, more than 10 landscapes in Spain and Portugal, in the Netherlands, in Germany, but also we started to work more in places, I mentioned India and Australia, also Latin America. And that's a way further where they can look into. We have a platform as well, which I can share with you. But the next thing is that increasingly more actors are knocking on our doors and say, can you do a small course on this fortress thinking? And those actors are more actors like in Albania, who have been working in the field and are working in the field for many years and just want to work more in this holistic way and want to be guided. For individual people, we have a lot of material which you can see on the web, and we are part of a larger networks, which we also can share. And there are MOOCs, massive open online courses as well, that they can attend. You can even get some certificate. If you're a student, you can get a certificate or something like that. So there are many opportunities. The whole way of being active. So you can always play a role in this world, always. And at the end, we would love to see a kind of new industry popping up, where indeed the heart goes first, and we call it the holistic landscape industry. And we already see it emerging. Yeah. It is happening, and it will not go away because there's no other solution.
You're creating, honestly, such a beacon for it, and I think it's there's so many people out there. I mean, people are constantly writing in just to, Life World's just the podcast, and this is like a tiny drop in that ocean's, people all around the world. So I think, beacons that make all of those desires more visible and legible and create a movement. And I'm really excited by that. So I'm going to link to a lot of notes. Willem, it's been such a joy. I am feeling so inspired and yet calm and by everything that you shared and the work that you're doing in the world. So it's been such a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you much. Thank you very much, Alexa. It was wonderful to speak to you, and please continue with this wonderful podcast. I've listened to several items now, and it's wonderful. Thank you very much.
I'll try. Thank you.
Thank you.
So there you have it. I have shared many links in the show notes with Commonland's resources, links, frameworks. If they are active in your region, I would obviously encourage you to get in touch or to use their frameworks for your own brainstorming, communities, projects. And just to end, I want to sort of double click on one of the things that Willem spoke about, where he says, you can write books about landscape ethics with all kinds of principles, but it's more about living it and doing it. And as you have heard from him in his stories, communities go through this process together. We go through pain and trauma, but you're able to face it and witness the wounds, and it makes you stronger and kinder and more generous. And so I just want to emphasize this dual track of inner and outer restoration in this kind of work. And personally, I think the profound possibility and healing that it can bring about. So that's it from me, folks. I'll see you in just a few weeks to speak about nature-centered human development with Bill Plotkin from Animas Valley Institute. Over and out.